When rescue teams found Jake Morrison's fishing boat drifting empty on Lake Cascade, his GoPro was still recording. And what they discovered on that footage has left investigators absolutely speechless. I've spent the last 3 weeks analyzing every frame of this disturbing video, and I need to warn you, what you're about to see will fundamentally change how you think about what's really out there in our forests. But here's what nobody's talking about. If this creature was capable of making an experienced outdoorsman vanish without a trace in broad daylight, what does that mean for the thousands of people who go missing in our wilderness every single year? Jake Morrison loved his Saturday mornings on the water. For 15 years, he had been making the same trip to Lake Cascade, a massive body of water nestled deep in the Idaho wilderness. The lake stretched for miles, surrounded by dense pine forests that seemed to go on forever. Jake knew every cano, every hidden fishing spot, and every safe place to anchor his small aluminum boat. His friends called him the Lake Master because he understood these waters better than anyone else in town. On September 16th, Jake loaded his gear into his 16-foot fishing boat, just like he always did. His wife Sarah watched from their dock, waving as he pulled away at 6 in the morning. The sun was just starting to peek over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Jake had his tackle box, his favorite rod and reel, and something new this time, a GoPro camera mounted on his hat. He wanted to record his catches to show his grandson Tommy, who was learning to fish. The boat's small motor hummed steadily as Jake headed toward his favorite spot near the North Shore. The water was calm that morning, like glass reflecting the trees and ski. Everything seemed perfect. Everything seemed normal. Jake had no idea that this would be the last time Sarah would see him alive. When Jake didn't return by sunset, Sarah called the sheriff. This wasn't like her husband at all. Jake was always home by 4 in the afternoon, always reliable, always safe. The search began immediately. Boats from the county rescue team spread out across the lake, their spotlights cutting through the darkness. They called his name over loudspeakers. They searched all his usual fishing spots, but they found nothing that first night. The next morning, a rescue helicopter spotted something floating near the eastern shore, about 3 miles from where Jake usually fished. It was his boat, drifting in slow circles with its motor still running. The engine was putting along at idle speed, wasting the last drops of fuel in the tank. When the rescue team pulled alongside, their hearts sank. The boat was empty. Jake's tackle box sat open on the middle bench seat. His fishing rod lay across the bow, the line still in the water, with the lure attached. His life jacket remained strapped under the seat where he always kept it. A half-eaten sandwich sat on the cooler, wrapped in plastic. His thermos of coffee was still warm. Everything suggested that Jake had been there just moments before, like he had simply stood up and vanished into thin air. But it was the GoPro camera that made everyone's blood run cold. The camera was still recording, its red light blinking steadily. The memory card was nearly full. The battery was almost dead. When Deputy Collins reached out with shaking hands to turn it off, he noticed something else. Long, deep scratches on the boat's aluminum hull. Fresh scratches that definitely weren't there before. The metal was gouged in 4 parallel lines, like something with massive claws had dragged its hand along the side. The rescue team towed the boat back to shore and carefully removed the GoPro. Nobody wanted to watch the footage right there on the lake. Something about those scratches in the empty boat filled them with a dread they couldn't quite explain. They took everything back to the sheriff's station, sealed it as evidence, and called Sarah to let her know they had found the boat but not her husband. That afternoon, Sheriff Martinez sat down in his office with Deputy Collins and 2 search and rescue volunteers. They connected the GoPro to a laptop and pressed play. The video started normally enough, just like you would expect. Jake appeared on camera, smiling and talking about the beautiful morning. He pointed out an eagle flying overhead. He joked about finally catching the big one. His voice was cheerful and relaxed. For the first 2 hours of footage, nothing unusual happened. Jake cast his line. He reeled it in. He ate his sandwich. He poured coffee from his thermos and commented on how peaceful everything was. The only sounds were the gentle lapping of water against the boat, the calling of birds in the trees, and Jake's occasional humming. It was exactly what you would expect from a quiet fishing trip. But then at the 2 hour and 17-minute mark, something changed. Jake stopped humming. His head turned sharply toward the shore, about 50 yards away. The camera on his hat turned with him, focusing on the dark tree line. For a long moment there was only silence. Then a sound echoed across the water. A deep, hollow knocking noise. Wood hitting wood. Thanks, thanks, thanks. 3 times, slow and deliberate. Jake's breathing got faster. You could hear it clearly on the audio. He set down his fishing rod very carefully and reached for a pair of binoculars. The camera shook slightly as he lifted them to his eyes. On the video, you couldn't see what he was looking at through the binoculars, but you could hear him whisper 2 words that made everyone in that office feel ice run down their spines. Oh God. The knocking came again, this time from a different spot along the shore. It was moving. Whatever was making that sound was traveling through the forest, following the shoreline, matching the slow drift of Jake's boat. And Jake knew it. You could tell by the way his hands started to shake, by the way his voice cracked when he said very quietly into the camera, "Something's watching me." Jake started his boat motor, but he didn't speed away like you might expect. Instead, he moved slowly along the shoreline, keeping about 40 yards from the trees. The camera captured everything as he steered with one hand and held his phone in the other, trying to get a signal. No bars. Lake Cascade was too remote, too deep in the mountains for cell service. Jake was completely alone out there. The knocking sound stopped. For 5 full minutes, there was nothing but the quiet rumble of the boat motor and the sound of Jake's heavy breathing. Sheriff Martinez and his team leaned closer to the laptop screen, watching the tree line in the footage. The forest looked normal. Tall pine trees, thick underbrush, shadows between the trunks. Nothing moved, nothing seemed out of place. Then Jake saw it. The camera jerked suddenly as he turned his head. There, standing between 2 large pine trees about 30 feet back from the shore, was a figure. It was huge, easily 7 or 8 feet tall. The shape was dark, covered in what looked like black or dark brown fur. It stood on 2 legs like a person, but the proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were too wide, at least 4 feet across. The arms were too long, hanging down past where the knees would be. And it was completely still, just standing there, watching Jake's boat drift past. Jake's voice came through the audio, shaky and small. "What are you?" he whispered. "What are you?" The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there like a statue. Jake grabbed his binoculars again and focused on the creature. Through the camera, you couldn't see the details he was seeing, but you could hear his reaction. A sharp intake of breath, a whispered curse, then, "Its face, oh God, its face is looking right at me." The boat drifted past the spot where the figure stood. Jake kept the motor at low speed, moving slowly along the shoreline. He turned the camera back toward the trees where he had seen the creature, but it was gone, vanished, like it had never been there at all. Jake killed the motor and let the boat drift in silence. He was breathing so hard now that the camera shook with each breath. For 3 full minutes, nothing happened. The boat bobbed gently on the calm water. Birds called from the forest. Everything seemed peaceful again. Then the knocking started once more, but this time it was much closer, and it was coming from multiple directions. Thunk, thunk, thunk from the left. Thunk, thunk from the right. Like whatever was out there was communicating, talking to others of its kind. Jake started the motor again, and this time he gave it more gas. The boat lurched forward, cutting through the water at a faster pace. He headed toward the middle of the lake, away from the shore, away from those sounds. The camera showed the shoreline getting smaller behind him. Jake was talking to himself now, or maybe talking to the camera for anyone who might find it later. His words tumbled out fast and nervous. "I've fished this lake for 15 years, never seen anything like that, never heard those sounds. I'm getting out of here. I'm going straight back to the dock." But then the motor coughed, sputtered. Jake looked down at his fuel gauge, 3/4 full, plenty of gas. He tried the throttle again. The motor ran rough for a few seconds, then heckled moved out. Jake breathed a sigh of relief and kept heading toward the center of the lake. He was about half a mile from shore now, far enough to feel safer. That's when the howl came. It wasn't like any wolf or coyote anyone in that sheriff's office had ever heard. It was deeper, louder, and it had an almost human quality to it that made your skin crawl. The sound rolled across the water, echoing off the mountains. It seemed to come from everywhere at once. Jake spun the boat around, the camera panning across the entire shoreline. There was nothing visible, just trees and rocks and shadows. Then came another howl, answering the first one, this time from the opposite shore, then another from somewhere to the north. Jake was surrounded. Whatever these things were, there were multiple creatures spread out all around the lake. The howls continued for almost a minute, back and forth like they were having a conversation. Then, suddenly, silence. Jake made a decision. He pointed the boat toward the southern end of the lake, where a small marina sat about 2 miles away. If he could make it there, he could get help. He could call Sarah. He could tell someone what he saw. The motor roared as he pushed it to full speed. The boat bounced over the small waves, spray kicking up on both sides. The GoPro footage became shaky and hard to watch. He was making good progress, about halfway to the marina, when the motor died completely. Not a sputter, not a cough. Just instant silence. Jake turned the key again and again. Nothing. He checked the fuel line. He checked the spark plug connections. Everything looked fine. The motor should work, but it was completely dead. The boat began to drift, pushed by a gentle breeze back toward the eastern shore. Jake pulled out his emergency paddle and started rowing. The camera showed his arms working, dipping the paddle into the water, pulling hard. He was trying to keep the boat in the middle of the lake, trying to stay away from those trees, but the wind was stronger than his paddle. Slowly, steadily, the boat drifted closer to shore. That's when the camera captured something that made everyone watching grab the edge of their desks. Movement in the trees. Fast movement. Something large was running through the forest, parallel to the drifting boat. You could see branches shaking, hear the crack of wood breaking. Whatever it was moved incredibly fast, covering ground that should take a person several minutes to cross in just seconds. It was keeping pace with the boat, staying hidden in the thick brush, but definitely there. Jake saw it too. He stopped paddling and just stared. The camera turned toward the approaching shoreline, now only about 20 yards away. The forest had gone completely silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. Just an awful, heavy silence that pressed down like a weight. Jake's breathing came in short, panicked gasps. Then between the trees, Jake saw them. Not just one figure, 3 of them, standing in a line along the shore, waiting, watching. The creatures were massive, all over 7 feet tall, covered in dark fur. They stood perfectly still, arms hanging at their sides. And they were staring directly at the boat, directly at Jake. The camera captured their general shapes, dark silhouettes against the darker forest, but the details of their faces remained hidden in shadow. Jake whispered into the camera, his voice breaking. "If anyone finds this, tell Sarah I love her. Tell Tommy to stay away from this lake." His hands were shaking so badly now that the camera image bounced and blurred. The boat continued drifting, now only 10 yards from shore. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe. I don't want you missing out on tomorrow's new Bigfoot story. Thanks for watching. Sheriff Martinez paused the video. His hands were shaking. Deputy Collins had gone pale, staring at the frozen image on the screen. The 2 search and rescue volunteers sat in complete silence. Nobody wanted to say what they were all thinking. Nobody wanted to admit what they had just watched. Martinez reached for his coffee, but couldn't bring himself to drink it. His stomach was churning. They sat there for a full 5 minutes without speaking. Finally, one of the volunteers, a man named Robert Chen, who had been doing mountain rescue for 20 years, broke the silence. "We need to watch the rest." His voice was barely a whisper. Martinez nodded and pressed play. The boat had drifted to within 5 yards of the shore now. The 3 massive figures still stood there, motionless, watching. Jake had stopped talking. The only sound was his ragged breathing and the gentle lap of water against the aluminum hull. Then one of the creatures took a step forward. Just one step, but it covered an impossible amount of ground. The thing moved with a strange, fluid grace that didn't match its enormous size. Jake grabbed his paddle and shoved it hard against the lake bottom, trying to push the boat backward into deeper water. The paddle caught on rocks, and Jake pushed with everything he had. The boat moved a few feet, maybe 2 yards back from shore. But it wasn't enough. The wind kept pushing it back toward the trees, toward those waiting figures. That's when the camera captured something that would haunt everyone who watched this footage for the rest of their lives. The creature in the middle tilted its head to the side, studying Jake. The movement was so human, so intelligent, that it sent chills down every spine in that office. This wasn't just an animal acting on instinct. This thing was thinking, planning, understanding exactly what was happening. Then it made a sound, not a howl or a growl. It was a vocalization that started low and rose higher, with clicks and pops mixed in, almost like a language, almost like it was talking. The other two creatures responded with similar sounds. They were communicating right there, right in front of Jake, deciding something, deciding what to do with him. Jake made one last, desperate attempt to start his motor. He yanked the pull cord with such force that the camera shook violently. Nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The boat was now less than 3 yards from shore. Close enough that Jake could see details he hadn't seen before. Close enough that the camera captured something that made Deputy Collins actually gasp out loud. The creature in the middle had a face that was partly human and partly something else entirely. The eyes were deep-set, intelligent, and they reflected the morning light with an amber glow. The nose was flat and wide. The mouth was surrounded by dark fur, but you could see the shape of lips. And those lips pulled back slightly, revealing teeth. Large, yellowed teeth that looked capable of crushing bone. The creature took another step forward, now standing at the very edge of the water. It raised one massive arm, and for the first time the camera got a clearer view of its hand. The hand was huge, at least twice the size of a normal human hand, with thick fingers that ended in dark nails. Not claws as kindly, but not human nails either. Something in between. Jake did the only thing he could think of. He stood up in the boat, making himself look as big as possible, and he yelled. He screamed at the top of his lungs, waving his arms, trying to scare the creatures away like you might scare a bear. For a moment, the three figures just stared at him. Then the one on the left made a sound that could only be described as laughter, a deep, rumbling, huffing sound that was definitely, unmistakably laughter. That's when Jake realized something terrible. These creatures weren't afraid of him. They weren't even threatened by him. They found him amusing, like a mouse trying to scare a cat. The power dynamic was completely wrong, completely reversed from what humans are used to in the natural world. Jake wasn't the hunter out here. He was the prey. The creature in the middle bent down and placed its hand in the water. The camera captured it clearly. The hand was massive, the fingers spread wide. Then, with barely any effort, the creature reached forward and grabbed the side of Jake's boat. The aluminum hull groaned under the pressure. Those four thick fingers wrapped around the edge, and then it pulled. The boat lurched towards shore so fast that Jake fell backward, landing hard on the bottom. The camera on his hat pointed up at the sky for a moment, showing nothing but blue and clouds. Then Jake scrambled to his knees and the camera righted itself. The boat was now touching the shore, the bow scraping against rocks and sand. Jake grabbed his tackle box and threw it. The heavy metal box flew through the air and hit the creature in the chest. It didn't even flinch, didn't move. Just looked down at the tackle box lying at its feet, then back up at Jake. Those amber eyes seemed almost curious, like it was studying how this small human reacted under stress. The other two creatures moved then, walking into the shallow water on either side of the boat. They were surrounding him, cutting off any escape. Jake backed up toward the rear of the boat, as far from them as he could get. His back pressed against the motor. He had nowhere left to go. The camera angle showed all three creatures now, standing around the boat like hunters around a trapped animal. The one in the middle reached forward again. And this time it grabbed the front of the boat with both hands. The aluminum hull crumpled slightly under the pressure of those massive fingers. Deep grooves appeared in the metal. Those were the same scratches that Deputy Collins had seen when they found the boat. Jake was crying now. You could hear it in his breathing. See his shoulders shaking. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his wallet, holding up pictures of Sarah and Tommy. "Please," he said, his voice breaking. "Please, I have a family. I have a grandson." He was begging now, showing the creatures the photos like they might understand, like they might feel pity. The creature in the middle stared at the photos, its head tilted again, that same eerily human gesture. For a long moment, nothing happened. Maybe 5 seconds, maybe 10. It felt like hours to everyone watching the footage. Then the creature's other hand came up, reaching toward Jake, the massive fingers spread wide. The hand came closer, blocking the camera's view. The footage went dark, not black, but covered. The creature's hand had grabbed Jake's head, covering the GoPro camera completely. You could hear muffled sounds, scraping, a thump. Jake made a sound, half a yell and half gasp. Then there was splashing, movement, the sound of something heavy being dragged. The camera stayed dark for almost 30 seconds. When the light finally returned, the view had changed. The GoPro was no longer on Jake's head. It was lying in the bottom of the boat, the lens pointing up at an odd angle. You could see the sky. You could see the top of trees swaying. But Jake was gone. The camera kept recording for another 6 hours before the battery finally died. 6 hours of an empty boat drifting on calm water. 6 hours of birds returning to sing in the trees. 6 hours of nothing but silence in an awful empty space where a man used to be. Sheriff Martinez stopped the video. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. They all just sat there trying to process what they had witnessed. The decision about what to do with the footage tore the town apart. Sheriff Martinez wanted to keep it locked away, classified as evidence in an ongoing investigation. He argued that releasing it would cause panic, that people would stop visiting the lake, that the town's economy would collapse. Lake Cascade brought in millions of dollars every year from tourism, fishing guides, boat rentals, campgrounds, restaurants. All of it depended on people feeling safe in those woods. But Sarah Morrison demanded the truth be made public. Her husband was gone, taken by something that shouldn't exist, and she wanted the world to know. She wanted answers. She wanted justice, even though nobody knew what justice would look like in a case like this. How do you prosecute a creature that science says isn't real? The footage leaked 3 weeks after Jake disappeared. Someone in the sheriff's department, nobody ever found out who, sent a copy to a local news station. Within hours, it was everywhere. YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, every major news network. Millions of people watched those final moments of Jake Morrison's life. Experts came out of nowhere to give their opinions. Some said it was real. Some said it was fake. Some said it didn't matter either way because the implications were too terrifying to accept and permit. Dr. Helen Reeves, a wildlife biologist from Idaho State University, studied the footage frame by frame. She measured the creatures based on reference points in the video. The boat was 16 feet long, a known measurement. Using that, she calculated that the creature in the middle stood 7 feet 9 inches tall. Its arm span was over 8 feet. Its hand was 14 inches from wrist to fingertip. These weren't guesses. These were measurements based on solid math. But it was the movement that convinced her the footage was real. Dr. Reeves had spent 30 years studying how animals move. She knew bear gaits, elk strides, mountain lion stalking patterns. The way these creatures moved didn't match anything in her database. The stride length was too long. The speed was impossible for something that size. A creature that heavy shouldn't be able to move that quietly through dense forest. Yet the footage showed it happening. More footage started surfacing after Jake's video went public. Other fishermen, other hikers, other people who had kept their experiences secret for years because they were afraid of being called crazy. A hunter named David Wu came forward with trail camera footage from 2 years earlier. His camera, set up to photograph deer, had captured something else. A dark, tall figure walking past the camera at 3 in the morning. The timestamp proved the footage was from September 20, long before Jake's disappearance. A family camping near the North Shore reported an incident from 5 years ago. They had heard the same wood-knocking sounds in the middle of the night. Their tent had been circled by something large, something that breathed heavily and smelled like wet dog and rotting meat. They had huddled inside, too terrified to look out, until morning came and whatever it was finally left. They packed up and never came back. The pattern became clear once people started sharing their stories. Lake Cascade wasn't the only place. Reports came in from lakes and rivers all across Idaho, Montana, Oregon, and Washington. Always near water, always in remote areas, always the same description. Massive bipedal creatures, intelligent behavior, wood knocking, and that terrible howl that didn't sound like any known animal. Then came the missing persons data. A researcher named Marcus Webb spent months compiling statistics. Over the past 20 years, 47 people had disappeared near Lake Cascade. 47 cases where someone went into the wilderness and never came out. Most were written off as drownings, falls, heart attacks, animal attacks. Bodies were rarely found. Searches turned up nothing. The cases went cold and were eventually forgotten. But Marcus noticed something that law enforcement had missed. The disappearances clustered around specific times of year. Late spring and early fall, when food would be scarce for large animals. When a creature would need to hunt more aggressively to survive. The pattern matched predator behavior, but not from any predator that science officially recognized. The search teams went back to Lake Cascade 2 months after Jake disappeared. This time they brought different equipment. Thermal cameras, audio recording devices, motion sensors, and something they never thought they would need, rifles with tranquilizer darts. If these things were real, if they were responsible for taking Jake, the teams wanted to be ready. On the third day of the new search, something triggered the motion sensors at 3 locations simultaneously, all within a quarter-mile of where Jake's boat had been found. The thermal cameras picked up heat signatures moving through the trees. Large heat signatures, bigger than bears, moving on 2 legs. The team called it in and waited for backup. By the time reinforcements arrived an hour later, whatever had been there was gone. But they found footprints in the soft mud near the shore. The footprints measured 17 inches long and 7 inches wide at the ball of the foot. 5 toes, just like a human, but much larger, and the proportions were different. The big toe didn't angle in like a human toe. It was straight, more like a thumb, perfect for gripping branches and climbing. A plaster cast was made and sent to 3 different universities for analysis. Dr. Reeves examined the cast carefully. She compared it to every known primate foot in North America. Black bears have 5 toes, but their prints look nothing like this. The arch was wrong. The toe placement was wrong. She spent weeks running tests, measuring angles, checking databases. Her final report was only 2 pages long, but the conclusion was clear. The print did not match any recognized species in North America. The implications of that statement rippled through the scientific community like an earthquake. If the print was real, if the footage was real, if Jake Morrison really was taken by something unknown, then everything we thought we knew about North American wildlife was wrong. There was an apex predator living in our forests that science had somehow missed. A predator intelligent enough to avoid detection, strong enough to overpower adult humans, and bold enough to hunt in daylight. Sarah Morrison never got her husband back. Search teams walked every inch of shoreline within 5 miles of where the boat was found. They used guide dogs, drones, and divers. They searched for 6 months before finally calling it off. Jake's body was never recovered. Legally, he was declared dead after a year, lost in a tragic boating accident. But Sarah knew better. Everyone who watched that footage knew better. The lake is quieter now. Fewer boats on the water. Fewer families camping on the shores. The fishing guides report that business has dropped by 60%. People are afraid, and maybe they should be. Because if Jake's footage taught us anything, it's that humans are not always at the top of the food chain. Sometimes we're just visitors in someone else's territory. Sometimes we forget that the wilderness belongs to creatures we don't understand, creatures that have been there far longer than we have. And sometimes those creatures remind us. The GoPro footage remains the most compelling evidence ever recorded of these creatures. Scientists still debate its authenticity. Believers point to the measurements, the movement patterns, the terror in Jake's voice. Skeptics claim it's an elaborate hoax, though they struggle to explain how or why someone would fake their own disappearance so convincingly. But for the people who live near Lake Cascade, the debate doesn't matter. They know what they've heard in those woods. They know what they've seen moving between the trees. They know that Jake Morrison was an experienced outdoorsman who knew how to stay safe, who knew those waters better than anyone. And they know he's never coming home. The question isn't whether these creatures exist anymore. The question is, how many of them are out there, hiding in the millions of acres of wilderness that humans rarely visit? And the bigger question, the one that keeps people awake at night, how many more people will disappear before we finally accept the truth?